legalization that has been maintained by the current regime of prohibition of cannabis. With this vote, we will have to be vigilant and analyze the report that the government will have to table in the Senate once it has reviewed the legislation 5 years from now, as Clause 51 obliges it to do so. Thank you.
Senator Doyle.
Honourable Senators, I wish to make a few remarks on Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis. And from the outset, I want to go on record as opposing the bill, which I feel is not in the public interest. I know that most of what I'm going to say will have been said many, many times before, either in committee or in speaking to amendments. However, I feel the issue is important enough to bear the weight of some repetition. The real and significant problems connected with the use of cannabis is out there for all of us to examine, especially as it pertains to young people, and yet we're well on our way to legalizing its use. We're cautioned by a multitude of sources that at a time when we're spending millions, if not billions of dollars, to discourage recreational tobacco use, we disregard public safety by legalizing a drug which is obviously much more dangerous. Many people wonder if it would not be more logical to place our money in programs that tackle the underlying cause of drug use and addictions, for example, poverty, family breakdown, violence, and mental illness. There's a myriad of things that cause people to reach for mind-altering drugs, and I have my doubts that the many problems associated with drug use will be solved with drugs and their legalization. I have other concerns as well. One is that Bill C-45 makes it easier to allow for the legal sale and distribution of yet another intoxicant for general public use. Anyone who watches the news will know that society is already in constant turmoil because of our abuse of three other types of legal intoxicants: tobacco, alcohol, and prescription drugs. Now we're about to add cannabis to the list of things that can so often lead to problems. And if the Government of Canada don't mind my asking, what is the rush to do this? The vast majority of the general public are not marching in the streets every day carrying placards that read, "Hurry up on the cannabis." Nevertheless, we're rushing to meet an artificial July 1st deadline for passage of the bill. That being said, I think my predominant concern with Bill C-45 has to do with its effect on Canada's youth. Indeed, the medical profession, we've heard it a number of times, has recommended that the age for cannabis use should be at least 21. Now, it seems that cannabis has a detrimental effect on the development of a young person's brain. In other words, for their own sake, kids should not be using cannabis in their formative years. The brain does not stop its development until 25. That is the information given to us by the medical professionals we have met with here on the Hill, who are very concerned with the passage of this bill in its current form. Really, are we listening to the medical professionals? If not, why not? Indeed, the position paper of the Canadian Pediatric Society urges the government to consider the dangers of so young an age to purchase marijuana. Again, the government keeps talking about protecting children, but completely ignores the evidence. Bill C-45 lacks crucial information, according to the former Minister of Justice, Rob Nicholson, and he's wondering why the current government is ignoring that crucial scientific information, information that has a tangible impact on the health and the best interests of Canadians. In a speech in the House, he said the government had plenty of time to study the impact of marijuana in several areas in the United States, but appears to have ignored it, which is really too bad. The former minister goes on to say that our American counterparts found an increase in impaired driving following the legalization of marijuana in certain jurisdictions. In fact, the U.S. Department of Justice found that on Colorado roads during the year following legalization of marijuana, that there had been a 32% increase in deaths related to marijuana-impaired driving. That is obviously unacceptable, he said, and why is it that we seem oblivious to these facts? According to the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, nearly 1 in 5 Canadian high school students have been a passenger in a car whose driver had recently smoked marijuana. Canadians of all ages are very confused about the many existing myths regarding smoking and driving. For example, in 2014, in a 2014 poll, 32% of Canadian teens believed that driving high is less dangerous than driving drunk. The spread of this kind of thinking will have serious consequences. A report prepared by the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse states that Canadians 16 to 19 years of age are more likely to drive 2 hours after ingesting marijuana than they would be 2 hours after drinking. We badly need a focused education program on these things. Still quoting the former Minister of Justice in Colorado, these studies have had far-reaching and tangible consequences. According to a recent report by the Colorado Department of Health, hospitalization involving patients with marijuana exposure and diagnosis tripled from around 803 per 100,000 to 2,413 per 100,000 after marijuana was legalized, an 8-year period. And that serves as a cautionary guideline for how children are going to be impacted by easy access and exposure to pot. While the bill deals mainly with legalizing the production and sale and consumption of recreational cannabis products by adults, we should never forget that adults are usually part of families, and that many families have children. And the sadly ironic thing is that Bill C-45 envisions that our cannabis revolution is going to occur, at least partly, on the home front in the home. In many homes, children are already exposed to adults drinking alcohol and smoking tobacco, and now they will be exposed to some adults smoking cannabis. Previously, because the recreational use of cannabis was illegal, there was at least some impetus for smokers to be a little bit discreet, especially if children were present. Will such discretion go up in smoke once the recreational use of cannabis becomes legal? These are good questions that people are asking and want us to be attentive to. Another problem that the medical people raised at our meeting was the danger to children in helping themselves to improperly stored edible cannabis products in the home. Many of these products look exactly like cookies or candies, and we all know that small children in particular are going to constantly be putting things in their mouths, whether it's a laundry pod or several cannabis-infused gummy bears. The result is usually the same: a trip to the emergency room. And again, the medical community are convinced that this area of concern is warranted. In summing up, not only will we be able to buy cannabis at the local liquor store, we can grow it, bake it, smoke it in the home. Is this the path that we want to lead our children down as we step into the 21st century? Is it conscionable to have our innocent children born into a society that has a lack of concern for their well-being? One of the government's main selling points on Bill C-45 is that a government-regulated system will be better at keeping cannabis production out of the hands of organized crime, and cannabis products out of the hands of children. I watched a documentary, I'm sure you caught it as well, on the Colorado situation just a couple of weeks ago, and organized crime is doing just fine in the price war. Legal growers sell for $10 a gram, and organized crime sells for $6.50 a gram. I'm not sure the bill will keep cannabis out of the hands of children. However, a concerned crackdown on organized crime, using the hundreds of millions of dollars we're spending on legalizing the drug, could have been a step in the right direction. The only positive thing I can say about the bill is that it has brought out many good, thought-provoking comments online. One woman, I went in online a couple of days ago, one woman said, "We accept many terrible laws today because the world's shouting overrides and drowns out the inner voice of a true conscience that God put within us." That was a very good line, I thought.
Senator O. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise today also to speak to Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis. And I have to say that anything I have to say here now, you've heard it all before, but I felt it was important that I put it on the record what my primary concern is with regard to this bill. The bill proposes to legalize the production, possession, use, and distribution of marijuana across Canada. The supposed purpose of the bill is to protect public health and safety, but its provisions appear to conflict with this objective, particularly for Canada's youth. Despite concerns over the many health risks associated with its use, the federal government is moving towards fulfilling its election promise to legalize recreational use of cannabis in Canada by July of this year. I would like to start by saying that recreational and medicinal use of cannabis are not equivalent and therefore should have different frameworks for access. Medical access to cannabis was first granted in Canada in 1999 with several amendments leading to the current access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations. Patients have the right to access cannabis for medical purposes if they have the support of a healthcare practitioner. The Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation have pointed out in its report entitled A Framework for the Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis in Canada that maintaining a separate medical stream provides the best route to ensure better patient safety and effective disease treatment. This separate framework would support patients and healthcare providers by helping to reduce stigma, provide uniform systems for ongoing patient monitoring, facilitate continued education for healthcare providers, provide incentives to strengthen research into effectiveness and safety of use, and develop novel cannabinoid-based therapeutics. Honourable Senators, there is a serious impact of marijuana on the health of our youth. The Canadian Medical Association has already warned the government that the use of cannabis has significant psychological impacts on brain development up to the age of 25, and recommends that 21 be the youngest acceptable age to legalize the purchase and use of marijuana. The Canadian Psychiatric Association has also recommended the minimum age of 21 for the recreational use of cannabis. However, the federal government has set the age of 18 as the legal age. Similarly, the Canadian Pediatric Society urges the government to consider the dangers of such a young age to purchase and consume marijuana, as its use at such a young age is strongly linked to cannabis dependence and other substance use disorders, the initiation and maintenance of tobacco smoking, and increased presence of mental illness, including depression, anxiety, and psychosis, impaired neurological development and cognitive decline, as well as diminished school performance and lifetime achievement. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health and the Canadian Pediatric Society have publicly stated that marijuana is not harmless and can have negative effects on the brain, especially young brains. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health has stated clearly that cannabis is not a benign substance and its health harms increase the intensity of use. Although adults are also susceptible to the harmful effects of cannabis, the developing brain is especially sensitive. An expert panel comprised of the Canadian Association of Pediatric Health Centre and the Pediatric Chairs of Canada has indicated that evidence suggests a direct link between significant mental health issues in youth and the regular use of cannabis, creating dependency, psychosis, and depression. Internationally, the World Health Organization has identified both acute and chronic health effects of cannabis use. Some of the acute effects of marijuana are the impairment of cognitive development, impairment of psychomotor performance in a wide variety of tasks such as motor coordination, divided attention, and operative tasks of many types, and the impairment of the use of complex machinery for as long as 24 hours after smoking as little as 20 milligrams of THC. According to the World Health Organization, some of the chronic effects of cannabis are the impairment of cognitive functioning, which include the organization and integration of complex information involving various mechanisms of attention and memory processes, impairment which may not recover with cessation of use and which could affect daily life functions through prolonged use, and the development of a cannabis dependence syndrome characterized by a loss of control over cannabis use. The World Health Organization has also pointed out that cannabis use can worsen schizophrenia in affected individuals, as well as increase pulmonary inflammations and injuries of the trachea and major bronchi caused by long-term cannabis smoking. Cannabis use can also cause the impairment in fetal development, leading to a reduction in birth weight and postnatal risk of rare forms of cancer if used during pregnancy. Our own Department of Health, on its website, on the Canada website, the Government of Canada website, outlines the mental health effects of cannabis. And I'll just read some of it off because just reading this now, it's absolutely amazing. And this is on the government website, and we're actually talking about legalizing cannabis. It says, in some people, cannabis use increases the risk of developing mental illnesses, such as psychosis or schizophrenia, especially those who start using cannabis at a young age, those who use cannabis frequently, and those who have a personal or family history of psychosis and or schizophrenia. Frequent cannabis use has also been associated with an increased risk of suicide, depression, and anxiety disorders. There is also evidence to suggest that combining tobacco with cannabis can increase the strength of some psychoactive effects and the risk of poor mental health outcomes, including addiction. Research shows, and this is also on the Health Canada website, research shows the brain is not fully developed until around age 25. Thus, youth are especially vulnerable to the effects of cannabis on brain development and function. The THC in cannabis affects the same biological system in the brain that directs brain development. Cannabis use has been associated with increased risk of harms when it is frequent, continues over time, begins early in adolescence, and some of the harms may not be fully reversible. And there's a lot more on the government website on cannabis and mental health, but that will just give you an idea of some of the items that are there. Despite this evidence, the government is resolved to legalizing cannabis this summer and therefore is disregarding all the warnings that the use of cannabis has for the health of Canadians, especially the mental health of our youth. This legislation will also be putting children at risk by having much greater access to marijuana. I am sure this concern echoes with parents of young children and teenagers. The bill recommends 18 years old as the minimum age of use, whereas experts have suggested the minimum age of 21. Legalized marijuana gives young Canadians the message that recreational drug use is permitted, risk-free, and acceptable. Just think of a 12-year-old who might be able to use and or distribute cannabis to his or her peers on the playground. The government is telling Canadians that up to 5 grams is acceptable, and as such is normalizing marijuana use among children and youth. Legalization of cannabis use may be interpreted, consequently, as a normalization of consumption, which can result in a consumption increase and ultimately lead to addiction. While the government has advertised that one of its objectives is to prevent young people from accessing cannabis, in reality, the bill does just the opposite. Bill C-45 is allowing people to have at least 4 marijuana plants inside their homes. This is quite concerning, as children can potentially access marijuana this way. For example, if parents are growing marijuana in the kitchen, there is no easier way for children or youth to access cannabis in the household. Youth are going to start using marijuana underage. With this minimum age and this unprecedented accessibility, it cannot be said that the government is protecting children and youth. Another issue that concerns me is edibles or cannabis-infused foods and drinks and their lack of regulations. In October of 2017, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Health voted for and passed 2 proposed amendments to Bill C-45 affecting edibles. The first amendment added edibles containing cannabis and cannabis concentrates to the types of cannabis that an authorized person may sell. The second amendment required that the addition of edibles must occur within 1 year of the bill coming into force. Thus, if this bill is passed, the sale of edibles by an authorized person should be legal in Canada by July 2019. Within a year, the government will need to draft and implement regulations dealing with the production and sale of edibles. This will be an important responsibility, as edibles are a controversial and complex component of the regulation of cannabis. It should be noted that the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulations report concluded that edibles should be legal in Canada and set out recommendations for their production and sale, despite the risks and concerns. Edibles pose serious health risks because they take longer to have an effect, which can lead to unintended overconsumption. As a result, some users may experience serious anxiety attacks and psychotic-like symptoms. Edibles can appeal to children and youth, especially if it comes in the form of candy or pastry. They can be indistinguishable from candy treats or baked goods often found in family kitchens. At this time, education will be central to prevent misuse. According to healthcare professionals, the consumption of several portions of edibles for any age group would result in different potential psychological effects besides the possibility of oversedation, anxiety, or psychosis. Several servings in a short time period can also produce intense anxiety, paranoia, and even psychosis. These adverse side effects are more frequent among the youth and first-time users, and these health risks cannot be underestimated. The expert panel, comprised of the Canadian Association of Pediatric Health Centre and the Pediatric Chairs of Canada, pointed out that government should prioritize training of health professionals to diagnose and treat accidental ingestion to minimize harm, as it is expected that there will be increasing visits to emergency departments by children who accidentally swallow edibles with cannabis. This same panel has indicated that federal government should determine the risks associated with consumption and addiction with regard to the increasing levels of THC concentration in edibles and concentrates. Honourable Senators, in concluding my remarks, I'd like to make a personal observation or a personal comment. Newfoundland and Labrador is a small community, and people know each other, or they know. If they don't know somebody, they know somebody who knows them. And it's a very close-knit community. And over the last couple of years, we've had a number of events or incidents whereby young people have lost their lives. They're involved in drugs. And, you know, these young people have passed away. They're in their 20s and they're in their 30s. And it's not just one young person, it's several young people. And in other cases or other instances, you know, I know of families whose children are addicted to drugs. And once you're addicted to drugs, to be rehabilitated, it's a long, hard road for those families, and it's usually involves relapses and going through the same rehab processes, you know, time and again. So some families are really struggling with drugs. If this legislation passes, and I, just listening to the speakers, you know, it seems that it probably will pass. I hope that the government will put adequate funding into rehab programs, into education, into mental health, all of those side issues that are going to come out of the legalization of cannabis. I know on the Finance Committee, I only attended a couple meetings of Social Affairs Committee and the Legal Committee on the 2 cannabis bills, but we did have Member of Parliament Bill Blair appear before the committee, and I did ask him the question how much money has been spent so far on education, because I had expected with the legalization of marijuana, looking us in the face, that there would be a lot of educational material, and we would see, a lot of advertisements. And he didn't have the information with him at the time. He gave me an estimate, and I said to him, no, I'd really like to have the actual number. And so I received it the other day, and the number is, I think it's around $9 million. I was really surprised at how low the amount of money that's been spent so far. The budget seems to be high. I think it's around $100 million, but the actual number that he gave was quite low. So I do hope that if this bill is passed, I do hope that with all the tax revenues that are anticipated to flow into the government coffers as a result of legalization of marijuana, I hope some of it can be diverted into the programs that are going to be needed to deal with the effects of the legalization of marijuana. Thank you.
Senator Maltais en débat.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. C-45 is no doubt one of the most important pieces of legislation that most of us will ever have to vote on. It's a bill that is fundamental and that will transform our country. Is it for the better or the worse? The future will tell. Everyone was interested in the health issues, profit, a bit of all, but personally I was interested in agriculture. As I'm a member of and have been a member of the Agriculture Committee for over 6 years, I was looking at what that might mean for the agricultural sector. First of all, in January, I met with the mayor and councillors in my area, and they enlightened me. They were wondering what would happen to cannabis residues. And when was that question asked here? And I said, I'll do some research. I'll look into that. And of course, at the Agriculture Committee, the Agriculture and Forestry Committee that is chaired by our colleague from Prince Edward Island, we heard from many witnesses. There were some funny ones and there were some serious ones. There were some funny ones because they were coming to sell their products. And I asked them what they used to do before. Oh, well, I was in the tech sector, and another said he was in auto parts. And I congratulated them on having become farmers, because since Confederation, there has never been so much money in agriculture in Canada. Could be thousands and millions of dollars. And I think even in the most difficult times in Canada, I don't think there have been so many foreign or local people who have been interested in Canadian agriculture. And so I said to myself, if we put that money into turnips and carrots and salad, we could feed half the world. But salad, carrots, and turnips don't pay the bills. And so there's no hidden profit hidden behind growing cannabis. These people don't exist for nothing. They are investing. They don't invest, rather. They're looking towards the future. And that's their right. We live in a free country. Congratulations.
So back to the issue of residues, because it seems that an enormous quantity of residues will be produced. That too becomes a commercial matter. We received specialists, we had specialists come before us at the committee, and most of them told us cannabis residue wasn't really that good for composting. Two of our witnesses told us that cannabis had no, but absolutely no effect one way or the other in compost. So I asked them, well, could you send a letter to our Minister of Agriculture and Forestry here in Canada to tell them that cannabis residue would have no harmful effect in compost or for agriculture? And they said, sure, we'll follow up. That was on the 8th of February, and now we're the 7th of June. And it seems the minister has not received a letter, nor has the chair of the committee received such a letter. So these people were just, talking through their hats. And the minister, well, I congratulate the minister because he seems to have told us the truth. When he was testifying before the Agriculture Committee, I asked whether the department had scientific studies to the effect that cannabis residue would cause no harm in compost. And the answer, no, we have no such studies. Perhaps the Department of Health has something, but I'm not sure. At least we got an answer. We got a follow-up answer on the 13th of March, in which we're told that given that there should be a good deal more cultivation of cannabis in the years to come, overview of potential issues for soil quality call for closer study. So there we are. Residues and their effect should be studied. Why am I going on about residues? Well, because people are composting these days, and the concerns of the mayors and those in charge of the municipalities were concerned about this. Everyone on their balconies now tends to put in some vegetables, some salad, your tomatoes in the backyard, and they were concerned about the compost. That the residue of the potential for cannabis plants would be mixed in with the residue of the other plants. And what will the result be? No one has been able to answer that question, and it remains a concern of mine. Because millions of Canadians may be affected. There are many more small cannabis plants may grow across the country. Halifax, St. John's, your town. People like gardening in their backyards, and may start gardening cannabis. So is cannabis an agricultural product? Medical cannabis producers have told us, no, it's a medical product. Oh, okay, then why isn't it being sold in pharmacies? If I want Tylenol, I go to the pharmacy. If my doctor has prescribed an antibiotic, I need to go to the pharmacy to get my prescription filled. But if I want pot or cannabis, I ask a pusher, or I'll be asking the Cannabis Sales Society, something like this. But if it's really a drug, a medication, it should be sold in the pharmacy. And if it's not, it should be an agricultural product. And that is what Canada's farmers came before us to say, that this was an agricultural product. Really? So if that's the case, if it's a product that can be grown on agricultural land, I mean, it certainly doesn't grow on asphalt, does it? So if it's an agricultural product, will it have to be managed using the same standards as other agricultural products? Pesticides, for example, pesticide use. Will it be regulated by the same legislation as the products of any other agricultural field? Will it be covered by the agriculture insurance in bad years, let's say, too much rain, a drought? Will the federal government cover for losses? No response. No answer on that. will we dezone agricultural land in order to be able to plant cannabis on these lands? We've no answer to that question either. So all this to show that I have looked this over very attentively, just as I have the legal related laws of my province, cannabis, microculture for interior or exterior growth. So we have at least one provincial law that assures us that it is an agricultural product. So nothing has really been solved. I mean, when it comes to what about the residue in compost that will eventually be used on fields of wheat or whatever else. Will it be harmful? The University of Guelph, one of their specialists, came before us to say that once the flower has flowered, what is left of the residue, 98% of the plant still has toxins in it. So that's not necessarily a good thing for health and public health. I had another question that came to me through one of my grandchildren. I went fishing with him 15 days ago. We were out on the boat on the lake, and he said, "Granddad, you're studying cannabis." And I said, "Yeah, we have legislation in the works on cannabis." And he said, "Look, could you tell me, Granddad, since I've been just a little one, Mom's been telling me that, cigarettes really, really bad, and that, Granddad, you have to smoke outdoors only. And in school, we're not allowed to do this or that or take that or whatever. So tell me, if we can't smoke cigarettes or even inhale cigarette smoke, why are you in Parliament voting on an act that will make more smoke? What's that about? Is cannabis smoke as bad as cigarette smoke?" And I don't think we've really had anyone tell us anything about that here in this place. So what am I supposed to tell my grandson? I'm not a doctor. And of course he pointed out again that I smoke, and I just said, "Well, grandson, keep in mind that there are a lot of old smokers, but there are a lot of more old smokers than there are old doctors." So, of course, part of this bill suit me entirely. Decriminalization, I'm entirely for that. But, unfortunately, everything's been mixed up. Everything has been mixed up. There are too many aspects being covered by this bill. The real question is, do we need to move ahead quite so quickly? A bill with 40 amendments? Well, that's because parliamentarians in both places have a lot of questions about it. Parliamentarians on both sides of the fence have questions. What we need to do is take these 40 amendments that you've put forward, get together in a committee, representing all of us equally, and look through each of these amendments and hear specialists who could speak to each of them. I don't want just a Sunday specialist. I want someone who really knows his or her stuff. And when we finish that, we'll be sure that we have come to a proper decision. Because, there's no emergency here. Parliament isn't burning down. And people aren't ready for this, nor is the government ready for this. The government really isn't ready. Unfortunately, when we legislate too quickly, we often have to pull back afterwards. And once you've let a genie out of the bottle, it's really hard to put it back in. It's hard to pull back. Madam Chair, I have a hope that parliamentarians, all of us, without ill feeling, decide to take our time and be in a better position to speak honestly to Canadians. We've received hundreds, at least I have, hundreds of emails asking me to go ahead with caution, to move with caution, to proceed more slowly. I'm not a statistician, I'm not a specialist in polling, but it seems to me that the people of Canada are deeply concerned. Some will say, all right, so it was an electoral undertaking on the platform. Very good. I've been in politics for 35 years now, and I've seen many such things, undertakings before elections. If everything that people said they would do had been done, well, we wouldn't even be here. Everything would be solved. So that's not really an argument. I was listening to Senator Eagleton earlier compare C-45 to the Prohibition Act. Not quite the same thing. Really not. Prohibition did not involve children of 10, 12, 15 years of age. It was about adult alcohol use. I'm a father and a grandfather, and so is Senator Harder. I'm not sure whether in 10, 12, 15 years, if he sees his granddaughter turn up with a joint in the living room, well, he just may say, where did you get that? Who gave you that? And, well, the granddaughter may well say, well, it was the government. My little cousin, yeah, but it was the government. My time is out. Very well. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Fellow Senators, I would like to speak on third reading to Bill C-45. Over 2 years ago, the Trudeau government announced they were beginning the process of legalizing the recreational use of marijuana. Since this was a part of their election platform, along with 226 other policies, including balancing the budget by 2019, they maintained that there was no need to consult with Canadians on whether legalization was the right path to take. And so, then Justin Trudeau's government launched a task force stacked with members who had vested interests in legalized marijuana and asked them for advice on how to proceed. Advice the task force was only too happy to provide for them. It's telling that at no time did the Trudeau government take a science-based approach to determine if this was good for Canadians. Their decision appears to have been based solely on ideology and political opportunism, with little regard for its impact on the social fabric of our nation. But many others have voiced their concerns. Over the last 2 years, the government has been repeatedly admonished for its recklessness and irresponsible approach to marijuana legalization. And yet, despite the chorus of voices warning the Trudeau government, it has steadfastly refused to listen. There is simply not enough time for me to even try to summarize all the concerns. I know my caucus colleagues have spoken mightily against the Trudeau government's approach to marijuana legislation. And also, in the words of witnesses from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, I quote, legalization will be a major and unprecedented social and health policy experiment. And I can't believe that this chamber of sober second thought is choosing to ignore the numerous warnings about many harms that will follow legalization. Instead, we just seem to be marching on ahead in a fog of self-induced opportunism with no solid evidence to support this unscientific decision. And we have heard repeatedly that we are not ready. Police organizations across the country began warning us a year ago that they would need more time to prepare. Healthcare professionals such as Dr. Sharon Levy, and she appeared before the Science, Technology and Social Committee. She's the medical director of the Adolescent Substance Abuse Program at Boston Children's Hospital and associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School, warned that healthcare infrastructure in Canada is not adequately prepared to provide appropriate treatment for teens with cannabis use disorders. And this problem stands to become much worse after legal sales of cannabis begins. She also stated that I have treated a number of teen cannabis users who developed schizophrenia right in front of my eyes. And she described about how the only way to adequately be able to console these young people was to put her arms around them and just hug them as tightly as she could until they finally started or stopped with the tremors and began to come out of this cannabis-induced psychotic disorder. She also warned that Canada has one medical specialist with her qualifications. So how on earth are we going to cope with the chaos, the medical chaos, emergency room visits that will escalate once this dangerous drug is seemingly approved? Mental health professionals have warned that the age of possession is too low. And some of my colleagues have spoken extensively about the effects on the brain. And my second reading speech was about anandamide, a normal brain substance, being similar in size and chemical shape as THC, allowing THC to trick the brain into thinking that this was a normally produced chemical. And the list is extensive. Of course, children and young people under the age of 25 whose brains are still developing, parents and families, social and religious groups, premiers, mayors, municipalities, law professors and associations, employers, condo and apartment organizations, and the list just goes on. I, for the life of me, cannot understand how on earth any government in any country could proceed with legislation that is so thoroughly being called out by every possible affected group. And even Indigenous groups have repeatedly said they were not consulted and they needed more time and were not ready. So I could go on and on with this "we are not ready" mantra, but it is a fact. It is beyond belief that the Trudeau government would choose to trample on the concerns of the majority of people across Canada rather than to take the time to study these concerns. I fail to understand why the government is in such a hurry and why this chamber appears ready to give its blessings to this trampling. The bill before us, sadly and dramatically, will change the fabric of our nation. And I do believe, or I do not believe, I should say, that history will speak kindly of the political masters and sycophants who are enabling this legislation, this dangerous drug, allowing it to become legalized. And history will surely condemn people in this place who support this legislation, who simply know better. This legislation, the cost of which will be borne disproportionately by our precious young people, whose lives will be broken, whose dreams will be shattered and disintegrate, and whose families will live with loss. And not every young person will experience these things, but too many will, and one is too many. So today, I will not vote for this Trudeau government agenda. I will not vote for C-45, Bill C-45, and I'm asking all the senators opposite to do the right thing and just say no to legalizing this dangerous drug. Thank you.
Senator Mockler on debate.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I heard her earlier, and I do agree with Senator Lankin on some subject matters, and I quote her. I believe that complex public policy will always have problems during implementation, and such a complex public policy as C-45, with so much for us still to learn, will for sure have problems. We should expect that and use the opportunity to learn from the challenges we encounter. Developmental evaluation, end of the quote. Chers sénateurs, je me dois...
Honorable Senators, I must tell you that I remain very sensitive to and even touched and affected deeply in my heart when I rise to speak in this debate, which will influence the lives of our children and change a public policy that may wind up having a dramatic effect on Canadians' lives.
Mother, born on welfare, and yes, I will share with you, I have seen the effects of substance abuse and the consequences, and there is no doubt others have some similar experiences. Also, with my approximate 34 years as a parliamentarian coming from the Legislative Assembly of New Brunswick to the Senate of Canada, this bill, C-45 cannabis, is going to change the quality of life of all Canadians. It is not good enough to justify passing such a bill, and we hear, because it will create jobs, because it will bring more taxes, because we have a majority, a government mandate. We promised it. Senators, it is said, only fools do not change their minds. Another justification, we must take it from the hands of criminals. Honorable Senators, I have made a lot of roundtables. I've had the opportunity to meet many New Brunswickers in the last 6 months, and they tell me we need more information. Why is the government, they said, fast-tracking such a policy decision that will impact on us? There is no doubt in my mind, this chamber, sober second thought, however, we have given it due diligence, and we have given it our best in this debate. Will we have a showdown with the government in the other house by ignoring our amendments? If so, I see Canadians will not accept that venue. Nevertheless, the day will come one day, Canadians will decide this matter, and God, thank you, we call it democracy, the next election. Senators, I agree with my colleague also from New Brunswick, Senator Lovelace Nicholas, that just said, having concerns and being skeptical to the letter that First Nations have received yesterday. Chers amis, as Winston Churchill once said, it is better to be both right and consistent, but if you have to choose, you must choose to be right. Honorable Senators, j'estime qu'avant de voter sur cette...
Honorable Senators, I feel that before we vote on this important bill, it is our duty and our responsibility as the Sober Second Thought Chamber to do our best to see whether this bill should exist, whether the aims are reasonable and can be reached, and whether, all said and done, this will have a positive effect on the well-being, health, and quality of life of all Canadians. As many of my colleagues have risen to say before me, it was essential that we take whatever time was necessary to think through its scope and to understand the impact that this potential new law will have on our Canadian society, wherever we may live in Canada, and to inform the Canadians, all Canadians, about the impact of cannabis on their health, and especially on the health of their children and all our grandchildren.
Concern over this legislation. First, since we represent the same province in this House, I would like to say that I share the concerns expressed by Senator Poirier, McIntyre, and Stuart Olson. Honorable sénateur, le sénateur McIntyre a certainement vu de très près.
Honorable Senator, Senator McIntyre has worked extensively in the law of Canada and has a good idea of what effect the cannabis use may have on our youth. Senator Stuart Olson.
The legislation and the lack of preparedness in our province on both the provincial government and the various police forces that will be responsible to implement such a policy. Honorable Senator.
Honorable Senators, I also share the concerns and proposals for improvements to the bill that I've heard from Honorable Senators Smith, Galvez, Boisvenu, Dagenet, and Carignan, as well as by Senators O and White.
Mind ourselves and let us think about it. Une étude comme celle du groupe SAM aux États-Unis.
A study such as that of the SAM Group in the States, which was entitled Lessons Learned from Marijuana Legislation in 4 U.S. states and D.C.,
well known across the world, made up of prominent medical and academic experts from respected institutions such as Harvard Medical School, Boston Children's Hospital, have looked at the impact on health, safety, crime, and the workforce in 4 states that have since 2012 legalized recreational marijuana use, namely the states of Colorado, Washington, Alaska, Oregon, and the District of Columbia. Their findings, honorable senators, were reviewed by prominent scientists and researchers who concluded that the SAM report serves, and I quote, as an evidence-based guide to what we currently observe in various states. Honorable senators, let me summarize their findings by quoting directly from their report. And I say, and it is said, today's highly potent marijuana represents a growing and significant threat to public health safety, a threat that is amplified by a new marijuana industry intent on profiting from heavy use. State laws allowing marijuana have, in direct contradiction to federal law, permitted this industry to flourish, influencing both policies and policymakers alike. While the consequences of these policies will not be known for decades, early indicators are troubling. And end of the quote. I have no doubt in my mind that the government did not pay attention to these scientific findings and the many others, despite their election promise that they would listen to scientists and act accordingly. Honorable Senator, lorsque j'ajoute ma...
Honorable Senators, when I pair my own concerns to those of my colleagues and those of many health experts, of education experts, those of representatives of municipalities and police officers, groups that will be affected by the legislation, then I can say, Honorable Senators, that the effect of cannabis use on the health of our adolescents will be of great concern. According to psychiatrist Didier Dutras-Aswad of the University of Montreal, who reviewed 120 scientific studies on this matter, the risk of developing a psychosis or even schizophrenia is multiplied by 4 or 5 for any adolescent using cannabis regularly. As it has been shown that the human brain continues to develop up until the age of 25 years, many health organizations across our land, including the Canadian Pediatric Society, the Canadian Medical Association, the Medical Society of New Brunswick, wished to ensure that the eventual law not allow for recreational use before the age of 25 years of age, and that no use be made before the age of 21. But we've seen that that is not held.
The comments made by various police forces, such as the Fredericton Police and the Ontario Provincial Police, that police officers will be ill-equipped and not sufficiently trained to ensure public safety in our municipalities and highways if the cannabis legislation is approved this summer. Honourable Senators, the legalization of marijuana will present new challenges for employers, including the possibility of injuries caused by impairment. Honourable Senators, the federal and provincial governments don't invest substantially in prevention and education programs. We will not be providing young Canadians with the information they need now to make such important decision for their physical and mental health. Honorable
Senators, I believe, just as the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs and organizations representing municipalities such as the Association of French-speaking Municipalities of New Brunswick, the Union of Municipalities of Quebec as well, that local governments will be called upon to ensure that the new legislation be respected on the ground and that citizens be protected from organized crime. They need the Canadian government's help and support. This is a necessity.
My last concern is that Bill C-45 will allow the sale of cannabis on First Nations, where substance abuse, we know, is already known to be a serious problem, often leading to the premature death of young Canadians. Certainly, the sale and distribution of cannabis should not be allowed on these First Nations until the community leadership has been able to bring these serious abuse problems under control. We should not fall prey to promises. I am very concerned on the fact that the First Nations have not been consulted. Some of the proposed legislation is even contrary to their right to self-government. Let us never forget the promises that have been made to First Nations in the past. Let us remind ourselves challenges in their communities such as mental health, addiction services, drinking water, and housing. And I've been here 10 years and we still have those challenges. Honourable Senators, it becomes more and more evident that the government has hurried this legislation and did not do its homework properly. They are not right on this issue now. We need time. They certainly did not take into consideration the many concerns raised by some 150 Canadian experts who appeared and testified before the 5 Senate committees. It is also evident that the legislation is passed this session. The government will not have all the regulation in place this summer. Therefore, Canadians will start growing their own cannabis plants without proper regulations. Why not take the time to better inform Canadians about the real impact of cannabis on our health, on their health? I believe that by rushing this legislation through, the government is missing a good opportunity, like Winston Churchill said, to get it right. Why not put this legislation on hold until January 1st, 2019 and proceed right away with a national information campaign on the dangers of cannabis on health and public and safety of our people? As Winston Churchill said, and I quote him again, "It is better to be both right and consistent, but if you have to choose, you must choose to be right." To the Government of Canada, let's take the time to get this legislation right. Merci beaucoup, chers sénateurs.
Thank you, dear senators.